This bill doesn't just have mandatory minimums for holding times if you get arrested. It has mandatory minimums that are not subject to parole or good time if you are convicted. So if you are convicted of a misdemeanor under this bill, and most of these things are felonies, but if you're convicted under a misdemeanor, 30 days minimum sentencing. No parole, no good time, nothing. The judge will have absolutely no choice but to sentence you to at least 30 days.
So last year there was what they called anti-riot legislation that went through the session, as this was the first opportunity for lawmakers in Alabama to address the police brutality protests of the summer of 2020. Working people all over the country from all sorts of different backgrounds, religious beliefs, and even political beliefs, while not unified on the specifics, all agreed there are issues with policing that need to be addressed. This was a common position across all sorts of working people, that there was a problem with policing in America, and they made their voices heard in the streets in the summer of 2020, and more people protested in these protests than any other moment in American history. So, Alabama Republicans responded by attempting to give cops more power. We tracked this legislation, and you can find our coverage of the legislation from last year linked in the show notes, but basically Republicans and their propagandists would have you believe that the legislation only increased penalties for, burning down a church or something like that, or murdering a cop's puppy. But that's not what it did. Listen to this. We've got a couple of clips from our conversation with Dev Wakely from Alabama Arise, a policy analyst with Alabama Arise, and he talks about what the bill does, what the bill did in the last session, and we'll talk to Felicia about what's different this year. Adam, let's go ahead and play that clip from last year, clip one.
What does this bill do?
This bill expands the definition of riots, and what it really boils down to is this bill will criminalize protected First Amendment activities. If you go out and you protest and a police officer sees somebody do something that he doesn't like, basically, he could arrest pretty much everybody involved. This is a blank check for unconstitutional arrests. Worst case scenario with this bill, and this is no exaggeration, if somebody is at a protest where somebody else that they are not involved with in any way interferes with the operations of a police dog that is, say, chewing somebody's face off, then that person can be arrested for rioting. That's how much of an overreach this bill is. And what we heard today was bill proponents say, well, this bill is not intended to do that. But that doesn't really matter because that's what it does anyway.
Yeah. I mean, that was a lot of the defense last year. A lot of the defense from the pro-bill people was that, that's not what it's meant to do. It's not meant to enable bad cops. It's not meant. Well, I don't care what thoughts are inside your head. I care about the words that are on this piece of paper that are going to become law in Alabama if you have your way. And that was the issue. And there was never any substantive defense against the accusations from people like Alabama Arise, from the Alabama ACLU, and other groups about this bill, about how damaging it would be for people's First Amendment right to protest. There was never any substantive defense about what they said. The defense was, it's not meant to do this. It's meant to do this instead, this good thing, or this thing that might not be as bad. But they never addressed the substantive issues. Let's go ahead and play clip 2 for how they expanded the definition of riot.
The definition of riot is a tumultuous disturbance in a public place or penal institution by 5 or more persons assembled together and acting with a common intent, which create, and there's a lot more weasel language in here too, which creates a grave danger, again, subjective, of substantial damage, subjective, to public, private, or other property. I don't know what other property would be, or serious, subjective, bodily injury to one or more persons, or substantially subjective, obstructs a law enforcement or other government function.
So you notice that he pointed out every time, oh, this is a subjective word. This is a subjective word. This is a subjective word. Every time he did that, who is going to be deciding what it means? It's going to be the cops in the field who we just had a historic response from the American people, from working people all across the United States, that the cops have too much power. And when I opened it by saying that the Alabama Republicans' response to working people in Alabama saying cops have too much power was to give them more power, this is exactly what I'm talking about. That this bill gave cops more power to decide when and where and how loud and for how long and how often people can protest. And that's and none of those things are in the law. Those things are decisions that are going to be arbitrarily made by cops. And that's not acceptable. That's not acceptable. And not only did it expand the definition of riot and give an insane amount of discretion to cops, and we know how well that works in Huntsville, right? It also established a mandatory holding time if you are arrested under this law for the mandatory holding time in the first round. This bill was reintroduced later in the session last year, but the first iteration of it had a mandatory holding time of 48 hours. The charge could be dropped, as most cases were. Virtually every single case of protester where a protester was arrested in 2020, virtually every single one of those cases was ultimately dropped because they were unlawful arrests. There was no substance behind the arrest of these people. And they still, even without this law, it disrupted people's lives because they were only held in prison for a couple of hours or for a few hours before they could post bail. And they still lost jobs. I talked to somebody just last week about somebody losing jobs. And think about the economic ramifications of a working class person having to be holed up for 48 hours without being able to tell their job, I'm not going to be able to make it in. Even if they could tell them that I'm not going to be able to make it in. How many people that work in precarious environments is that going to fly for them for?
Right. How many bosses are going to be very understanding?
Right.
Hey, sorry, I'm calling you from jail. I was arrested at a protest. I won't be back for a couple of days.
And this mandatory holding time of 48 hours is more than for many violent crimes. That shows that the purpose of this law was not to protect property, to make protests more civil. It was to discourage protests. It was so that cops would have the arbitrary discretion to jail people for whenever they felt like it. And that's not acceptable. And it also made defunding the police, quote unquote, something that people could be sued for. And there was so much wrong with that. It's bad on its face, number one, because people ought to be able to protest. And yes, even disturb private and government functions. That's our right in America. But we can see how this law will be used against striking workers on picket lines as well. And we have enough laws, as we have seen in Brookwood, Alabama, we have enough laws that are used against striking workers in America today.
And that's what I was going to say is, not just the subjective decision-making on the fly of police officers, but then when you are charged, now you're in the hands of a judge.
Right.
Who, the Brookwood, Alabama picket lines is a great example. And we saw this in Colorado with strikers in Kroger stores, where these judges, they use their discretion to come down hard on striking workers and community allies who are there on a picket line.
Yeah. Well, the law was defeated in the last session, but it's back. In fact, it was pre-filed before the session even began, and that's why Felicia is here today. Felicia Scalzetti is a digital organizer for Hometown Action. Felicia, thank you so much for talking to us today. I appreciate it.
Thank y'all for having me on.
So the first question for this is just how much of this new bill, how much of it is the same as the bill that was filed in the last session?
It's essentially identical. There are a few changes, like, for instance, the definition of riot is now what the definition was of the old bill towards the end. So as you kind of alluded to, there was a lot of pushback last year. And so the sponsor of the bill and other people on like just various committees tried to add or remove language to make it less vague and blanketing of a law, and it still did not help. So now when they put it forward that the current, in this 2022 iteration of this bill, the current definition of riot is the assemblage of 5 or more persons resulting in conduct which creates an immediate danger of damage to property or injury to persons. The amount, that is, you could drive a semi, you could drive a fleet of semis through the hole that creates. Creates, that's entirely subjective to officers there. So creating a danger to property, not that you've caused damage, because if you cause damage, that's ends up being aggravated riot. Right. I mean, yes, that's absolutely already a crime. It also says or injury to persons, which I find really funny because I'm not a lawyer, but injury to which persons? Like, if you have 5 people and there's a bar fight, that's injury to persons, but I don't think we normally call that a riot. There's a lot of things under here, like, assemblage of 5 or more persons where there's an immediate danger of property damage. Like, that's just tailgating. That's just tailgating. Right. That's a barbecue. That's, and this bill goes on to define public places, including parks, open spaces between apartment buildings. Basically, anything that is not a private residence is considered public under this bill. So, when we're talking about an assemblage of 5 people, like that's a couple of teenagers on the corner. Right. It's incredibly, incredibly broad.
Right. What about the holding time? Is that was that carried over?
Yeah, it's still there. It's 24 hours now.
How generous!
Really, really. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And here's the thing about holding times. So I think y'all mentioned that you had people who talked to you about losing their jobs after even being just held a few hours. I was not held for just a few hours, and that was without a minimum holding time, and that has been the experience of a lot of people I know. And as far as I know, that clock does not start until you're booked, and that time that it takes to get booked, I mean, they slow walked us. I don't know how much I can say that without it being like technically like libel or whatever, but they would slow walk us because you're not booked and in the system until you're fingerprinted and you have your mugshot taken. Well, for a lot of us, that'd be 7-8 hours in, and if that's when the clock starts, I mean, there's a lot, there's so much gray area in what can happen. There was a one time where we got arrested and they had us on a bus for 2 hours, not going anywhere, just in the bus, so you're not even at the station yet. So like there's just so much that I could see this going wrong with normal activities, criminalizing, especially Black people, because this bill is explicitly racist, used to union bust, because if you just picked up a bunch of union supporters, or I don't know, the way that RWDSU was outside of the Amazon facility in Bessemer on public property, but how you could just arrest everybody, they'd be held for 24, what would likely turn into 30 plus hours. And then you have to fight this bill, and then you're trying to, pay people's fines, you're trying to coordinate court, like that's a lot. And people will not show up if they think that there's a possibility of them getting caught into some sort of criminal net, just by trying to exercise their right to free speech.
Yeah, well, let's talk some more about the, we have, detailed since the beginning of the strike almost, there were, in Brookwood, there were injunctions filed against the union, limiting the number of people on the picket lines. At first, it was 11 or 12, then it was 10, then it was 6, then they were banned completely. Now they can have 2 people on a picket line at one time. So we've already got lots of laws on the books that are specifically designed to attack working people's right to picket and protest and things like this. But how would you envision this being used against, say, the coal miners in Brookwood, or other unions who go on strike or picket, do an informational picket in front of their workplace?
Well, so this bill goes on to define a riot specifically. So, I mean, it gives that definition that I gave before, but it also says a person commits a crime of riot if, after receiving an order to disperse by a law enforcement officer or when in violation of curfew, the person intentionally participates in a riot. And I'm not being facetious, like that's literally how they define it. So, I mean, when you look at the miners, when you look at people striking or picketing outside of their workplace, a lot of them probably were told to leave by cops. And under this bill, that would count as violating, an order to disperse. And it doesn't say a lawful order to disperse, by the way. It just says order to disperse.
And we know that cops give lots of, just factually, cops give lots of unlawful orders, specifically unlawful orders to disperse.
Yes, they do. So, I don't know that word being in there makes this bill so much better. There's still so much in here that's incredibly harmful. But, when you take this as a totality, right, you can deter people from ever showing up in the first place under pain of, just fear of losing their job, having a criminal record, having issues with this showing up on background checks. We were told that even with these charges being dropped, we'd be eligible to pay for them to be expunged after a year. So that's a burden to prove that this never, the charges would be dropped. They didn't, you weren't convicted of anything, but just the arrest record itself is punitive for jobs and that sort of thing.
That in itself. You have these mandatory
holds.
I was going to say that in itself, the arrest record, that's such an important thing for folks who, have never gone through that, who may not realize that. It's great news to hear that your charges have been dismissed, but it's not over at that point. It is still tied to you and your record. As you mentioned, that's a whole nother process and a whole nother set of fines and fees and dollars out of your pocket that you may not be able to afford.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Expungement is not an automatic process. You have to go and talk to a judge, and you likely need to retain a lawyer, and you need to pay money.
Right. And that's fine if you're in management and you're bringing down 6-7 figures a year, you can probably afford to get out of something like that.
Right.
But the average person in Alabama and across this country certainly is not making that kind of money. Certainly not in Alabama.
Right. And let's talk about what happens if you do get convicted. Because this bill doesn't just have mandatory minimums for holding times if you get arrested. It has mandatory minimums that are not subject to parole or good time if you are convicted. So if you are convicted of a misdemeanor under this bill, and most of these things are felonies, but if you're convicted under a misdemeanor, 30 days minimum sentencing. No parole, no good time, nothing. The judge will have absolutely no choice but to sentence you to at least 30 days. If you get arrested and you're charged and convicted of a felony, 6 months.
Wow.
6 months minimum. And again, no parole, no good time, nada. And let's talk about some of the things that might get you a felony under this bill. Such incredibly harmful to the public health as committing the crime of unlawful traffic interference. Do y'all know what unlawful traffic interference is? Unlawful traffic interference under this bill is if you intentionally or recklessly impede vehicular traffic by walking, standing, sitting, kneeling, because I had to put kneeling in there, lying down, or placing an object in such a manner as to block passage of a vehicle on a public highway or interstate.
Wow.
So if you put traffic cones out there, that's unlawful traffic interference. Now, the first time you get arrested for this, it's a misdemeanor. And again, if you're convicted, that's 30 days. But the second time you get arrested, that's a Class C felony.
Wow.
For kneeling in the road.
That blocking traffic.
And imagine if you're blocking access to your workplace because you're picketing.
Exactly. Yeah,
Right.
that's the thing. Even if it's a picket where you're allowing people through. So there were maybe 3 or 4 times over the course of this strike that the UMWA has over the course of the strike in Brookwood. 3 or 4 times the UMWA has purposely impeded traffic. They have purposely said, we will not let scabs cross this picket line today. It's not going to happen. And people were arrested for it. They were, they spent like a night in jail or something. But this law, if I'm understanding right, would have them first be sentenced to a minimum of 30 days in jail.
If they were convicted of it, yeah.
That's insane.
And I mean, on its face, they would be guilty of that crime, right?
Right. That's insane.
And
that's just not, that is just not, if you value I mean, people in a democracy should be able to say, like, that should be one of the weapons that we have in our arsenal to delay traffic, to disrupt the public order. This has to be something that people can do, and that's something that people in the labor movement have done to great success, to higher wages, better working conditions, better benefits, since the labor movement began, is these disruptive protests.
Yeah, I was going to add, I may be jumping ahead of us, but civil disobedience is the history of progressive change in this country. And by progressive change, I don't mean necessarily any political persuasion, just bare minimum progress.
Right.
Ending slavery, ending Jim Crow. These were done by social movements. All change in this country has come from the bottom up, from people organizing, protesting, utilizing civil disobedience. And, you mentioned earlier, Jacob, about what they meant. Oh, we didn't mean this, or we did mean this in the bill. For me, looking at this as a resident of Alabama, the only thing I can infer is that they mean to completely discourage civil disobedience and protest and free assembly. Right. And for those who are, brave enough, I suppose, to try it anyway, to punish and really ruin people's lives.
Right.
For having the audacity to stand up for themselves and exercise their rights under the First Amendment of the Constitution, which, these same folks love the Constitution. Now, they love to talk about the Constitution. They love to talk about American values and our rights and our freedoms. After all, that's why folks hate us, I'm supposed to believe. I was growing up, I was told that all these folks halfway around the world hate us because we're so free.
Right.
So, that's my interpretation as a resident of Alabama who has engaged in protest activity. I'm getting the message loud and clear from the Alabama legislature that we should cease and desist, that we should sit down and shut up and stay home. Well, keep shopping. Now, we can keep shopping, but do not engage in any sort of protest against your government. And mind you, these are the same people who are supposed to not like government and want to shrink government. But damn it, you better not say anything about it or actually try to do that. And that's the interesting thing is I remember Tea Party protests. Mm-hmm. Now, granted, most of those were astroturfed by the Koch brothers and other right-wing billionaires and their front groups. But there's indisputable evidence that there were gatherings of conservative and right-leaning, right-wing kind of people in what would be a protest. So that'll be the other interesting thing to see if this bill goes through, the subjectivity and how it's enforced. Mm-hmm. And because I'm very curious to see how different the response might be to, say, an anti-vaccine, anti-mask type of protest at a school board versus a Black Lives Matter protest or a picket line in front of a workplace.
Yeah.
Well, it's really interesting that you mentioned that if that they want you to stay home, because actually under this bill you can get arrested for that too. And this is another insidious piece. I know, right? I told you, it just gets better and better. So they go on to talk about inciting a riot, right? That's a charge in here that they beef up. Oh, no. It's so much worse than you think. Here's the definition, right? Inciting to riot if he or she commands, solicits, incites, funds, urges, or otherwise aids and abets another person to engage in a riot or aggravated riot. Let's break that down for a second. Did you catch that bit, funds? Like, I don't know, maybe mutual aid funds, or I don't know, maybe how like the miners have been like collecting money from people to pay, not to pay, but like literally to sustain their children and their lives and their mortgages and their grocery bills. And how now, if you determine that the miners rioted at some point, maybe everybody who, I don't know, put money into PayPal or Cash App or whatever, you just funded a riot.
Wow.
We're really concerned about that with it. I think they want to shut down bail funds, really, is I think what the intention there is. But again, This is so broad that it's anything. The other thing that this means is, when we were out there, and I see this happening at picket lines too, people will drive up and drop off water and basic supplies. You are aiding and abetting. You are funding in the sense of like, you're giving in-kind donation. Like it's incredibly insidious. And I just want to hit one point. I know usually hear people talk about this when they talk about this bill, as in like where it originally comes from, because it is true that this was first introduced after the uprisings in 2020, that this bill in particular in Alabama is actually supposedly written by, we're going to get to that in a second, but has been put forward by Representative Turtleway, who represents part of, Jefferson County and was the, I believe, deputy chief of police of the Birmingham Police Department at the time that he wrote this bill. Or presented this bill. But the thing is this bill and this language is not new. At the time that this bill was presented last year, there was, I think, 75 anti-protest bills in 33 states. And you don't get that kind of proliferation unless you guys are copying something. And it turns out the thing that they're copying is this bill from 2017. It's called a critical infrastructure bill, which, like all really insidious bills, uses a ridiculous name to distract from the actual intent. So what that bill is supposed to do and why it was created to begin with was to target indigenous people in South Dakota after the water protectors and Standing Rock protests. That's when we started to see these types of bills. So what the critical infrastructure bill is, and by the way, we also have a critical infrastructure bill in making its way through in Alabama right now. We've had one almost every year for years now that is not passed, but is also part of current pending legislation, and it says like anything within X miles or X yards of I don't know, oil refinery or a pipeline or I don't know, maybe a coal plant. Yeah, it's critical infrastructure, and it carries with it increased penalties and fines. Like it bumps everything up to felonies, and we're talking 10 years. Like the original 2017 like the South Dakota one was a 10-year imprisonment if you in any way tampered with was considered like if you blocked access to pipelines or things of that nature, so they just upped the ante. And this bill takes language from that, just sort of takes pieces from these bills. It's like watching a virus replicate. You see it pop up originally in one place, and then you get all of these variants. We've been incredibly fortunate that in Alabama, we haven't seen the running protesters over variant yet, but like this has, this is directly
There's still
related.
A lot of time left in the session.
I know. But I mean, I always struggle between like scaring people versus like, hey, this is like, you need to be looking for this. This is an issue. Something else in here too, if you really want to bankrupt people, if you really want to drive a union out of business, if you're convicted of any of these, anything, I'm talking like blocking traffic, anything, you also have to pay any medical bills. You have to pay any amount of damage that you cause to the area, anything. And that's all, of course, incredibly subjective because who determines that, right? So like it's a cash cow. And differences from last year is that we have this new context of these 3 new prisons.
Right.
We have these 3 new mega prisons being built, and if they want to make money off of them, they need to fill them up. And this is a really easy way to pack them full of short-term people who are going to be paying a lot of fees, fines, restitution, and whatever. And if you get the added bonus of, I don't know, breaking the back of a union in the process, well, that's just the cherry on top, isn't it?
Right. Well, so this is all insane, but we've seen a lot of this before. You mentioned that it's almost identical to last year, and it didn't pass last year. How did it happen that it did not pass last year? What stopped it last year?
It came down to the wire, but I really think that the primary thing that stopped it was Black women organizers just really put themselves out there. We drove down to Montgomery. For those listening on the radio, I'm not Black. I'm a white woman. But we drove down to Montgomery anytime that this bill was in committee, anytime that it was being heard in any capacity. We really kicked and dug in our heels. We called for a public hearing. And last year, entrance to the State House was limited. Like, we literally could not go inside and talk to legislators. If you've tried to contact your legislators before, you might know that a lot of their emails bounce and their voicemails are full. So if you don't actually have access to them, it's really hard to let them know, like, hey, a lot of people are upset about this, by the way.
Right. Yeah. Well, just really quick, I want to, these are all the same people that you can't reach because access to the State House is limited. These are the same people that are telling us that it's that teachers are horrible and lazy, and they got a year of pay or 2 years of paid vacation because of remote learning, and they're going off on Madison County and Huntsville City educators for remote learning this week because they literally don't have enough staff to staff the schools, and so that's just super weird that they're not at their workplace while they're chiding us to get back to work. That's odd to me. That's odd, but that's a different subject.
Well, they were in there. They just didn't want anybody else in there, which is just, it was also very funny, right? Because they were talking about health concerns and then not wearing masks. Yeah. So like whose concern actually, and that was a really big decision for people too, was that, like, when we look at health disparities and outcome disparities from COVID, like Black Alabamians are disproportionately hit and disproportionately are dying for this. So when you're talking about, do we actually go in there to have a public hearing, like, that is a health concern too. Right. So like, that's how bad, this is, that's how deeply we care about this, is that, we're willing to put our health at risk with reasonable precautions and wearing masks and trying to, be as safe as possible. But like, that's how important this is. So during that public hearing, well, they can't really be reached right in person. Maybe they got berated quite a bit by even their own colleagues. So, most of our Democratic elected officials are Black. Treadway was told to his face by a colleague of his on the same committee that he was acting like Bull Connor with this bill. And that wasn't enough to stop that same committee from passing it at the end of that meeting. I remember going to a committee hearing, waiting for it to pass out of the Senate, I think, or on the House floor. And within it was just an hour. And within that hour, they had passed like an anti-abortion bill, anti-trans bill, not passed like as into law, but just committee, out of this, had passed anti-trans, anti-abortion, the anti-protest bill, and there was something else too. And I remember just looking around and looking at everybody, all of us who have multiple identities, during the uprisings, trans people and gay and just LGBT and marginalized and queer people were very much disproportionately the ones arrested. Women were disproportionately the ones arrested. We like literally 20 women to every one guy getting arrested. And so you see this piling on, right? You wouldn't think that the protest bill and the trans ban and the abortion bill and all these things that we're all sort of fighting in these different corners They're all connected because they're just all part of, let's put the same people down.
Right.
Let's put the same people who historically make the least amount of money, have the least protections, need unions, need these protections the most, are the most likely to be horribly affected by having an arrest record or by having, missing work or anything. Let's make sure that we keep them down still, because if they ever figure out that we're after all of them,
right,
we might not have enough people to put that down.
So what are its chances, what are its chances of passing this time?
I don't want to speak anything into existence. I waffle between oh God, it's gonna get through this time, and maybe we have a fighting chance. So just in context, things that are different this year. We do actually have those prisons. They're built. They're a real thing now. It's not just some people accused us last year of being overly dramatic about that. Well, they're here now, and they are being built with COVID money. So if you really want to talk about legislators' priorities when it comes to taking care of Alabamians, well, there it is right there, right? Other things that are different this year, Bamazon had a huge national following. And I think it's incredibly important that RWDSU gets ahead of this and this messaging, hey, this is going to come after us. You are coming after us. UMWA, that's different than last year too. And having these minors talking about hey, you know what, y'all, we think that this is something criminalizing specifically Black Alabamians, but guess what? They're using it against us too. So that's interesting. Maybe this is a little broader than we think. So that's kind of in the pluses side. All the other things on the plus side, and by plus I mean chances to get it defeated, right? Is that legislators are probably pretty sick of being in session. They've had to be in multiple special sessions. They had the prison special session. They had redistricting special session. They started the regular session early this year in January instead of in March, like they normally do. So they really haven't really gotten any breaks. And now they're in another special session, and then they're going to have to come back to regular session. The biggest thing, and this could either be a plus or minus, the biggest unknown factor here is that these legislators are running for re-election.
Right.
2022 is an election year. Every single person is up for re-election, essentially, basically statewide in Alabama. So on one hand, they want to pass things that they can message to people at home and say, look at all these great things that I've accomplished. And so you see this proliferation of, gross bills. I don't have a nicer way to put it, just gross bills that are just not what we need in Alabama. On the other hand, they likely want the time to go home and, campaign for re-election. Normally, you'd think that that's not a huge concern, but we did just redistrict. So technically, some people's lives are changed. They need to canvass new neighborhoods. They got to talk to different people. So
get new bribes. They're going to want
yes, right.
Yes, and donations. So they actually, I think today or tomorrow is the day that they can start getting donations again, because when a session starts. In an election year, they actually can't fundraise for the first 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And now they're also in this special session on ARPA money. So there's all of these, I think it's very funny as somebody who grew up watching the Newsies and other, stories about toppling these big things. It comes down to such subtle things in reality, what is the schedule and do people want to go home early on Friday? And that's the real. So last year, the bill almost passed. It was on the special, it made it basically all the way to the last stop, essentially, on getting passed. And it just stalled out for time. The gambling bill ate up a lot of time. And I remember staying up till midnight because on the last day of the session, they literally went until midnight trying to get the gambling bill through. The trans bill, the anti-trans bill was on the docket as well. And we basically ran out the clock. That when we say defeated, that's really what it is. It's running out the clock. So when we're looking at running out the clock this year, those are sort of the things that are weighing on this. So far, unlike last year, this bill so far does not have any co-sponsors, which is interesting. Now, it did originally get introduced without co-sponsors last year, but a few weeks in, it had 20.
Right.
It was part of the GOP agenda, the Alabama GOP agenda for bills that they want to pass this year. So by no means can you count it out. And bills can get, co-sponsors and just not be uploaded right now because we're in a special session. So I don't want to rest on laurels. I don't want to count this thing out. I want to hit it hard. I want to hit it fast. our leverage points when it comes to defeating legislation is early. You can only have a public hearing if it's in a committee. You can't, by the time it gets to a floor vote, people will likely just follow along party lines, and then that's that. So
Right.
you're the best way to get this done and out is to really give them an out. Don't vote against this bill. Just don't bring it up. Slow walk it. You don't have to tell your constituents, I voted against the, aggravated riot act. You just don't bring it up at all.
Mm-hmm.
Just don't even open that can of worms. Don't even touch it. And the best way to convince them to do that is to make it very clear that this isn't a winning issue for you. This isn't a winning issue for you across multiple demographics. This is not what you want to be running on. This is not your bread and butter politics.
Yep. Felicia, thank you so much for talking to us about this. This is a very important issue that is going to affect a lot of working people, our rights to protest our government and our workplace. And so that's very important. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And if you want to find out what's been going on with Hometown Action and get updates on this legislation, please follow us. Our link tree with all of our social media links is HMTN, like hometown, HMTN. So it's linktree/HMTN. Or you can find us on Facebook at Hometown Action, Instagram, same handle, Twitter, same handle, Hometown Action. So thank you all so much for having me again. It's been amazing. And thank you so much for bringing light to this important issue.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
We'll put those links in the show notes.
Work sucks, we know, but you can make it better by organizing with your fellow workers. For more information, call or text the Huntsville Industrial Workers of the World at 256-651-6707.